The story begins with a conversation between a very pretty young girl and a man. She asked him in all seriousness if he really wanted to know the whole truth. But the man, looking into the eyes of his interlocutor, said that he didn't care, and these words pierced her heart like a sharp knife. It was today that she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. At that moment, the stunned girl did not even know what to say to the young man. She stood and silently looked into his eyes, and only the sea waves beating against the ship broke the silence. The man saw that the beauty named Rosen was about to say something important, but after his words she just looked at the man in silence. So he told her not to be silent. In her mind, she said that trust is a rather dangerous word. Therefore, the greater the trust, the deeper the wound at the time of betrayal, and the hatred that immediately replaces trust is as great as possible. The events are transferred to the past, when the same young man during the interrogation asked Rosen if she could lie. The young girl, without a doubt, immediately answered that of course not. Then the man read from her file that the girl is extremely skilled in fraud, persuasion, and swaying to her side. She also has a high intelligence and is quite skilled in eloquence. The man continued to read her description, which also said that everyone should be extremely careful when talking to her. Rosen just smiled sweetly and said that she had no idea what it was about. The ship on which this important conversation between Rosen and the young men was now taking place was on course for the island of Montevites, and in spite of the storm at sea, they hoped to arrive in time. The young man looked at this defenseless girl, and he so wanted to believe her. The description he read brought him back to reality, and he asked if she had repeated those words in court. Rosen smiled and replied that of course she repeated, but the judge did not even try to swallow it. And then she wondered if this case was also written in her characteristics. Then the beauty bowed her head and stated that even during the arrest she tried to prove her innocence, but no one believed her, even though she was telling the truth. His gray eyes were staring intently at Rosen, and he couldn't believe how this sweet beauty and the terrible thief, who was written about in the description, could be one and the same person. Therefore, the man, following the rules, asked her name. The girl smiled slyly and said that there is not a person in this area who does not know him. But the man insisted on answers. The girl replied that her name was Rosen Oker, but the man said that he was not interested in her real name. He wanted her to name the name written in his document for identity verification. The girl looked at the man and understood that he would not let go of her so easily, so she said that her name was Rosenhaus. He nodded with satisfaction because that was the name he wanted to hear from her. To Rosen's great surprise, the man began to read her biography, where it was written that at the age of 17, she was sentenced to 50 years in prison and sent to Fair and Women's Prison. A year later, Rosen managed to escape from a women's prison and she crossed a cliff completely naked and went through a mountain range. 3 months later, she was found in St. Benji and was arrested again. After that, Rosen received an additional 25 years to her sentence and was sent to the high-security Al-Cafes prison. But 5 years later, she managed to escape again. The man tore his gaze away from the document and looked into her eyes. He said the document said Rosen managed to escape from Al-Cafes by digging a hole with a single spoon. He asked if what was written here was true, and she, smiling, said that he would be even more surprised if he knew what she had to do to get that spoon in prison. Rosen began to tell how much she had to endure from the dirty jailer for that spoon, but the man abruptly stopped her and told her to answer only the questions he asked. The girl smiled and said that of course she would fulfill all his requests, because she knew that Iowan Connor would not be joked with, especially when he was performing his official duties. Iowan Connor was a war hero whose name was celebrated throughout the country, and even when he was sitting across from her now with a gloomy face, he still looked incredibly attractive. During the war, there was not a single person who did not know his face, because thousands of postcards with his image were dropped daily from the plane, from which his melodious voice could be heard. All the people raised their heads as if enchanted as he flew over them. The authorities knew very well how to actually charm the common man and influence the general public. Iowan Connor, a young and noble pilot, became an excellent tool for influencing the masses of people in the conditions of a brutal war, and people believed in this man and needed him more than ever. The young girl remembered how she first learned about Iowan and was brought back to reality by his stern voice asking her what she thought about her accusation. Rosen tried to straighten her hair with her hands, and the shackles they were tied with prevented her from doing so, and their iron rattle reminded her of where she was now. Iowan asked her if she knew the reason for her being sent to Monty Island, a prison known to everyone as the most brutal prison in the world. His gaze pierced the girl and waited for her answer. The man reminded her that she had already escaped from prison twice, and besides, it was because of her that the pride of the Imperial Army had been completely destroyed. He was interested in the primary reason for her imprisonment, The young girl really wanted John to believe her, and, looking into his eyes, she said that she was not to blame. But the young man was firm in his decision, so he sternly reiterated that he was not interested in her personal opinion. So he reiterated once again that this was only a formality. When Rosen again reiterated that she was not guilty, the man replied that no criminal would ever actually plead guilty, but because of her stubbornness, her conviction would not go away. The girl tried to prove that although everyone does not believe her, God is a witness that she is not guilty of anything. John sharply replied that he was not at all interested in her opinion and demanded a clear answer from her. Suddenly, the door to the room suddenly opened, and a nervous young man rushed in and asked the commander what he was doing now. Iwan calmly replied that he was conducting a personal interview with the criminal. Rosen at that moment thought that this ignorant person scared her so much that she almost swallowed her tongue. Iwan added that studying the identity of the intruder is a direct duty of the person responsible for his transportation, especially if this intruder needs special attention. Henry replied that he understood his commander, and why trouble himself, especially knowing that only the worst criminals were sent to Monty Island. Then the young man's eyes looked at the woman sitting across from the commander, and he shouted that he needed to be extra careful when dealing with the witch of Alcafez. The man insisted that despite the fact that the girl looks like a woman, she still remains a cruel criminal who killed her husband at the age of 17. Rosen bowed her head and flinched as Henry said she had stabbed her husband 36 times, suggesting she continued to stab him after his death. Rosen couldn't stand it at that moment and shouted that it wasn't her at all, because she always loved her late husband, and this murder was the work of bandits. The girl with tears in her eyes tried to prove that bandits were responsible for her husband's murder, because the man had many envious people, and these scumbags can kill anyone without even blinking an eye. Rosen screamed that no one wanted to listen to her, and didn't even do enough investigation to find the killers. From the look of the girl, it was already clear that she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Then she burst into tears, saying that no one wanted to listen to her because it was easier for everyone to put her behind bars and make her guilty of murder. John watched the young lady tell her story, and then sternly told her to stop with this performance, because what kind of wife she was had nothing to do with her crime. Rosen shuddered in surprise. No one had ever reacted to her crying like this before, so she was surprised that John didn't believe her. Iwan added that according to the verdict, only she is guilty. Rosen tried to draw attention to the fact that she is a fragile girl who cannot handle a man, and the commander asked how then this fragile girl escaped from the prison of Alcafez and Farina. He confidently walked up and looked her in the eyes, adding that all the prosecution's evidence pointed to her involvement in the murder, so he had no reason to doubt it. Iwan ordered his assistant Henry to take the intruder to her cabin, and the young man tugged painfully on Rosen's shackles, shouting for her to get up immediately. At that moment, a thought flashed through the young girl's mind, exactly where she would be taken now. Henry kept pushing Rosen, telling her to move faster. She understood that their relationship is a relationship between a criminal and a warden. Everything is the same as a battle between a cat and a mouse. It is worth relaxing once, and she will be caught immediately. The girl thought that compared to her former supervisors, these men were simply well-mannered gentlemen. Usually in such a case, she would be kicked in military boots. She looked at the back of a handsome man who was walking in front and came to the conclusion that she managed to find ways out of the most difficult situations, so this time she will come out victorious. Passing the hall, Iowan Connor asked if the party was over, and Heron replied that they would not dare to lead the Witch of Alcafez past worthy ladies and gentlemen. But the commander noted that all these gentlemen are on the liner precisely because they are going on a tour of the prison, and he thinks it would be extremely interesting for them to see Rosen. Heron pointed out that Iowan thinks this way because he is a very talented commander, but in reality, people are not as brave as he is, especially since their views on life changed a lot after the war. The ship, which until recently transported the wounded and was filled with gunpowder smoke and the sound of shots, suddenly turned into a place for luxurious parties, accompanied by joyful music. This ship was currently on course for Monty Island. Detainees who are taken there consider this place to be the most terrible, and keeping their lives there is already a great achievement. Tourists who expressed a desire to see this place with their own eyes also sailed on the same ship that transported prisoners to the prison. They already gave thrills and headed for them. Heron noticed that even the corpses that were transported by this ship smelled better than the current prisoners, so it could cause nausea in tourists, which is why meeting them should be avoided. Connor said they didn't look any better themselves during the war, but Heron objected, saying that it was a completely different matter, and while they were defending the country, this woman killed her own husband. Heron also added that she managed to escape twice, spending state taxes on her search. Rosen replied that he is too noisy and his mouth never closes because of conversations. Connor watched their altercation and sternly told Henry to stop wasting his nerves on these pointless conversations with the prisoner. And then he apologized to Rosen for the rudeness of his subordinate. John said they should follow him because he had something to show them. And Rosen and Heron went to the deck of their ship. Although Heron constantly reminded that it is not worth losing vigilance with her. When the young girl was on the deck, she stopped and grabbed the railing. Rosen could not take her eyes off the incredible beauty of the night sea. The storm had died down by that time, and the sea was mesmerizing with its greatness. Rosen couldn't help but admire the amazing beauty of the lunar path that sparkled against the dark background of the sea. When the young girl looked at this beauty, she caught herself thinking that she would have to become the most famous criminal in the whole world to get to this place and see this amazing sight. The young girl was torn from admiring such a beauty by Connor, who asked if she really managed to escape from the famous Alcafeza prison with the help of a hole she made with a spoon. Rosen said yes. Connor then asked if she really went naked over the cliff and added that people said she used magic in her last escape. The last successful escape from Alcafez was accomplished by a witch 36 years ago. When the press began to write that Rosen managed to escape from prison, people were sure that she was also a witch. People by their very nature are very afraid of things they cannot understand. And in an era when science is developing more and more, magical abilities are subject to more and more condemnation. But traces of the mysterious past continued to exist, so there were not many witches who remained carefully hiding in the most secret places of the world. The young girl confidently replied that if she really was a witch, not only would she not be in such a predicament, but they wouldn't even have managed to capture her. Rosen raised her shackled hands and asked Connor if a witch could afford such an attitude towards her, and added that it would be absurd to have her on this ship. Heron began to worry about his commander, so he shouted at him not to be tempted to believe this criminal, because not a word of truth came from her mouth. The man added that they had seen for themselves, reading her file, how during the first hearing she successfully pretended to be a victim, shedding tears in such quantity that they could flood the entire empire. Then Rosen looked at him with a smile and said that if she really was a witch, she would immediately sew his mouth shut so that he wouldn't sneeze so much. Rosen also said that she underwent a procedure to detect magical abilities. So what more evidence do they need, unless the military of this country is so stupid that they cannot understand it? Henry could not bear such insulting words from Rosen, so he decided to teach this scum. But before he had time to swing, Connor harshly addressed him by name. When Heron looked at the commander, Iowan ordered him to take his hands from the prisoner and move away. And if he continues to not control his emotions, then Connor promised to show his superiors. Henry took his hands away from Rosen in confusion, although he didn't really expect the commander to stop him. But John ordered him to quickly transfer what he asked. The girl looked at Iowan and waited for an explanation of what he had in mind. The man, meanwhile, began addressing the girl as a well-known runaway from the Empire and a witch from Alcafez. John said that he didn't care if she was a witch or not, but he just wants to remind one more time about absolutely simple things that she should not forget while in his custody. And the first thing he wanted to remind her about is that she is convicted, who received her sentence and is now going to the cruelest prison on the island of Monte for life imprisonment. The second thing he wanted to tell her was that he had been ordered to escort her to this island and he would do it properly, so she had nothing to count on. Then he looked into her eyes and said that the third thing is that she is not the first woman who managed to escape from Alcafez, and no one has managed to escape from the island of Monte. The commander concluded his speech by saying that no person in this world could escape from this island, even if they were a witch. Rosen did not expect such a speech from Iowan, and noted about herself that although it is not open, he is still trying to psychologically intimidate her so that she does not talk nonsense on the way to prison. While he stretched himself out, telling these things, she looked around him, looking for some keys, either to the boat or to the handcuffs, because she understood that her only chance was to escape on the way to the prison. At the time when she had already found the keys hanging on the commander's belt, he was called by an assistant who reported that everything was ready and he had carried out his order. Henry walked up to them and said he brought what Connor asked for. Rosen looked at the object in the hands of the assistant commander with interest and tried to understand why it was for them. Henry brought a tray on which lay fresh pieces of meat, and this caused even more surprise in the young girl. The beauty stood on the deck and could not understand why he brought these pieces to his commander. Her brain began to go through different options, but she could not find a reasonable explanation. John Connor took a tray with pieces of meat and went to the edge of the deck and ordered Rosen to carefully watch his movements. Then he stretched out his hand and it froze above the sea waves. Then Iwan overturned the tray of pieces of bloody meat that flew into the open sea. He looked at Rosen and told her to always remember which sea they were sailing on. Heron started to laugh with satisfaction and turned to the witch. telling her to look more carefully at what monsters the sea is full of, and he has no idea what they will do to her. The men added that she really shouldn't even try to escape from the ship, and Rosen looked overboard, where only bloody stains remained from pieces of meat. The young girl could not tear her eyes away from this terrible sight, and already noted in her head that such a method would immediately disappear. Ioann seemed to read her mind and said that if she wanted to become a snack for the monsters, she should use the lifeboat and go on a one-way trip. The man approached Rosen in the shelter and showed her the keys that were jangling in his hands. He looked into her eyes and asked if she wanted to receive this particular treasure. Then he smiled wickedly and added that after what she had seen, she must have changed her mind about using the lifeboat keys. Then Rosen noticed about herself that Ioann was not a gentleman. The young girl was disappointed in this man and asked herself if she could have supposed that the overseer could be someone like a gentleman. Rosen looked closely at John Connor and thought that this violent man had nothing to do with the man she had seen on postcards during the war. She had no idea how he treated other people, but he treated her in a completely different way than she had imagined when she admired him while looking at the postcards. Then she realized that for this young man she would forever remain an imprisoned criminal who must be delivered to prison alive and unharmed. Once in her cell, Rosen began to think hard about whether there really weren't any other ways to escape from this ship. She was brought out of her thoughts by her cellmate, who asked the dreamy girl if she thought of telling her about her adventures she had recently returned from. Then Rosen asked what exactly the speech was about, and the woman explained that she would like to know about John Connor, because she is sure that Rosen had a private conversation with this warden. Rosen reported that he warned her that escaping from this ship was simply impossible, but the woman insisted that he had something more important to tell Rosen. A woman named Maria asked Rosen if Connor hadn't actually told her anything special, and Rosen asked her what she wanted to hear about it. With a sneer on her face, Maria began to fantasize that a pretty prisoner went alone to the office of a young and attractive warden. Then, of course, there is something special about this. Maria said that she could not suppress her raging fantasy in any way, and Rosen, looking at herself, asked how she could see a beautiful young girl in this dirty criminal. Maria did not calm down and said that Rosen is the youngest and most beautiful girl among them, so of course the man must have lustful desires, and asked if there really was nothing between them. Rosen asked Maria if she really thought anything could happen between John Connor and the rag. And Maria, smiling, said that this had already happened when they were in Alcafez. The young girl plunged into her memories and answered Maria that the problem was not only with the warden, so it was not worth risking everything to get close to him. Maria could not believe her ears that Rosen was saying such things, so she came closer to her and took her hands. The woman, looking into her eyes, asked if she was going to give up. Maria was a prisoner whose nickname, the Witch from Alcafez, suited much more than Rosen herself. If the prison guards ruled outside the prison cells, then it was a woman named Maria who had all the power inside the cells themselves. If someone did not like Maria, then by a strange coincidence of circumstances or for some other reason, he did not live to the end of his prison term. When Rosen was transferred to Alcafez, she had already managed to become famous with the help of her first escape, and the fame about her went inside the prison before the girl herself. But Rosen did not think of giving up and waiting for her death behind bars. Therefore, she had already managed to get a spoon and tried to make a ditch for her escape. At that moment, Maria approached her quietly and asked if the fugitive wanted to wake up all the guards with her scratching on the prison wall. And then the woman asked where she managed to get the spoon. The alarmed young girl looked at the unfamiliar woman and was worried that she would make a fuss and Rosen would be put in a cell with a particularly strict regime. But whether thanks to her knowledge or for other reasons, Rosen took a liking to Maria, and all the prisoners, among whom Maria was an authority, treated Rosen very well. Since then, her prison life had become calmer and she felt somewhat safe with Maria. But now it was only memories of the past imprisonment. Maria was now looking at Rosen with eyes full of hope and asking her if she was going to give up because she was in such a hopeless situation. Rosen looked at the other women who looked at the young girl with the same eyes and realized that for all of them, her victory and faith in their own strength was extremely necessary. All the prisoners, as one, wished that Rosen would completely trample the reputation and pride of the Imperial Army, and then live a quiet and peaceful life somewhere in a safe place. Then Rosen decided that it was not time to give up, because the belief in something better than all the prisoners in this prison would depend on her decision and mood. Rosen was a role model for them. Therefore, she took Maria by the hand and, looking into her eyes, said that she was not going to give up under any circumstances, and that very soon they would see it for themselves. Maria breathed a sigh of relief and smiled a little. She told Rosen that this was the only right decision, and they would all support the young girl at all costs. Maria threw Rosen a cigarette and said that now it was time to rest and put her thoughts in order. Rosen wondered where this rascal had managed to get cigarettes. After lighting up, the girls started chatting. Rosen asked if Ian was actually a pilot and what uncle he forgot as a prison warden. After all, this position is not at all suitable for a better pilot. Maria replied that according to the information she managed to obtain, John was crippled and was relegated to this position. But Rosen noticed that he looked like a fairly normal man. Rosen couldn't imagine how such a perfect man could be crippled. She remembered their conversation on the deck. What she heard from Maria and what she saw with her own eyes did not match. But Maria, smiling, said that being crippled does not necessarily mean losing a limb. Rosen asked, "What then?" And Mary mysteriously tapped herself on the head, hinting at John's problems. But Rosen refused to believe it and asked her friend not to talk nonsense. Then Maria, smoking a cigarette, said that she doesn't care if it's true or not, but there are such rumors. Maria said that it didn't matter, because it was important for them to catch him and find a way to get out of here. However, Rosen replied that such remedies work only on brainless men. Rosen began to think aloud about her next steps, and said that if she did manage to get the key, what would she do next? She doubted that she would be able to safely cross a sea teeming with all kinds of monsters in a lifeboat without a motor, for it was quite a dangerous adventure. Rosen narrowed her eyes and took a delicious drag on her cigarette. Maria watched the young girl and carefully followed the course of her thoughts in order to understand what her plan was. But Rosen continued to think that even if she managed to somehow avoid the monsters, she would still die from physical exhaustion. The young girl's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the floor. At first, the young girl thought that it was the work of the prisoners and shouted for them to behave more quietly because they were preventing her from thinking. When she looked behind the fence, she saw that a little girl was playing with a ball, and it was this knocking that distracted her from her thoughts. A question immediately appeared in her mind. What is this child doing here? The young girl began to ask Maria where this angel came from, and Maria replied that she had no idea, and she managed to persuade the little girl to bring them cigarettes. Rosen shouted to the girl that it was quite dangerous for her to be here and asked where her parents were. And then, in a stern tone, she told the girl to immediately return to her cabin. The girl immediately turned and looked at Rosen with her huge and blue eyes, full of wonder. She did not expect that someone would talk to her. Then the girl turned and ran towards Rosen, approaching close to the bars. Rosen told the girl to go in the opposite direction. When the girl came closer to Rosen, holding a pink ball in her hands, she greeted the prisoner and introduced herself as Lila Revel. Astute Rosen immediately remembered how Iowan had turned to his assistant and asked the girl if she knew Henry Revel. Layla immediately informed that it was her uncle. Rosen said that Layla shouldn't be here because it's not a playground, and mentally scolded that jerk Henry, who was doing stupid things instead of looking after the baby. Little Layla had tears in her eyes, and she said that she already wanted to show off to her peers that she would be able to meet the famous fugitive Rosen Walker on this ship. Layla said that all the people were talking about Rosen when they got on the ship, and her own grandfather, who was the captain of this ship, doubted that the girl would be able to meet Rosen. The girl said that no one believed her and she wants to prove to everyone that she will still manage to meet this famous fugitive. That's why she plays closer to the prisoners. Then the young girl smiled, sat comfortably behind the bars, and told the little girl that she congratulated her on the fact that Layla finally got to the address, and Rosen Walker was in front of her. Meanwhile, the two young men were on deck, and Henry complained to his commander that they had been given another headache in the role of this famous fugitive. John tried to calm the assistant, telling him to think that it was just a trip to the island, after which they would return home. Therefore, it is worth treating it as a journey. Henry was surprised that there are people who pay money to go in the same ship with dangerous prisoners through the sea, which is full of terrible monsters for the thrill. Joanne said that before the war ended, his partner turned into an eternally dissatisfied old man who constantly mumbles something under his breath. Henry then informed John that the Witch of Alcafaz was also from Rioriton. Connor did not know this fact about the fugitive, so for a few minutes he even froze in amazement. Henry said that he learned this fact from her biography, and it seems that she really lived in this suburban town until she committed the murder of her husband. Henry noted that he reported this fact specifically so that the commander would pay due attention to it. The assistant was sure that it was because of this fact of the biography of the witch from Alcafez that Iowan had a personal conversation with this prisoner, although there were no such cases in his career before that. Rioriton was their small homeland, where a military school was located. It was there that for the first time John sat at the wheel of an airplane and soared into the sky. And it was there during the hostilities that a bombardment took place, as a result of which their entire town, where the best years of their lives were spent, turned into solid ruins. Henry was annoyed that this witch was so strong that she managed to avoid death in her hometown during the bombing, because she was already behind bars. When Connor pointed out that she had a life sentence, Henry irritably said that it was her celebrity that got her to prison anyway with a talented escort like Io and Connor. Connor reassured his friend, saying that Monty Island is the most terrible place on earth, so it's not worth envying those who go there. But even these words did not calm Henry, who was angry with this cursed woman who had been annoying him more and more lately. The young man was angry because this criminal managed to survive, unlike his own sister, who remained during the bombing in her hometown. Therefore, he shouted that despite the fact that Rosen is sent to the worst prison in the world, she still remains alive and it is completely unfair to others. Little Layla cried out in surprise, because she could not believe that she finally managed to see the famous escapee from Alcage Rosenwalker with her own eyes. Rosen told her to keep quiet because it was a big secret. Meanwhile, Layla kept her eyes on Rosen and asked if it was true that she escaped from prison with a spoon. The young woman said that it was all true and everything that the local press wrote about her really happened in her life during the last imprisonments. But Layla was interested in the most unexpected question and dared to ask Rosen if she could really tell fortunes using magical abilities. Rosen looked curiously at this little girl, who dared to ask such frank questions to a dangerous prisoner, so she said that she also had a question for Layla. Then Rosen smiled and said that if the girl answered her question, then in exchange she would show some of her magic, and the girl could see for herself. The girl sadly reported that her grandfather forbids her to fulfill the prisoner's requests, so she doesn't even know what to do. Maria watched as Rosen deftly bred Layla. Rosen assured the girl that she would not ask her any provocative questions, so if Layla wanted to see magic, she would have to answer some of them. After much hesitation, the girl still agreed, and Rosen was once again convinced that she is simply the best at persuading people. So without delay, Rosen asked if she knew Ioan. The girl replied that of course she knows this famous pilot and that he is also the boss of her uncle. Rosen then asked the girl if he was close to her. The girl replied that John behaves very coldly with her, although the uncle claims that he loves her in a special way, because he knew the girl even when she was in her mother's womb. Layla also said that her uncle constantly repeats that she can consider Ioan Connor as another uncle of hers, because no one knows her better than him. That little girl nevertheless expressed her personal opinion that she would not be in a hurry to make such a statement, because he is far from similar to her uncle. After listening to the girl's story about the commander of the convoy, Rosen moved on to more delicate questions and asked if he was married, or if he had a girlfriend or a girlfriend. Layla is sure that Ioan is not married and there are no bridegrooms, because she knows how other adults worry about getting married sooner. But Ioan is completely different from them. Rosen then asked if the little girl had seen any young girls come into John's room and stay there. After thinking, Layla answered that she had not noticed such a thing. Rosen thought for a moment because she did not expect to hear such an answer. She didn't think about how a handsome man like Ioan didn't have a girlfriend at the moment. And then the young girl asked Layla if she didn't think John Connor was a sympathetic man. Rosen tried to find in this strict escort at least some threads of influence on him. But Layla's eyes just opened wider and she asked, "How is this sympathetic?" The little girl did not understand this word and was waiting for an explanation from the witch from Alcafez. Then Rosen herself thought for a moment how to explain this to the child. Maria came to the rescue and said that it means when a person sympathizes and feels sorry for another person. Rosen turned and looked at Maria with a feeling of gratitude because she did not know how to explain this feeling to such a small girl, with which, unlike Rosen, Maria coped very skillfully. Maria continued to give an example so that Layla would understand better and explained that it is when you bring home a kitten soaked through, or how you start to cry when you see someone else crying. That little girl carefully listened to the explanation from the grown women, and then smiling, asked them if they were talking about such a feeling as love. Rosen's eyes lit up from the fact that she finally managed to explain to Layla what she wanted from her, and she nodded her head, saying that this was exactly what she meant. Looking at Rosen's reaction, Maria joked that this feeling made the witch sweat, and Rosen, turning to Maria, urged her to close the pelka and not interfere with her work. Layla thought, and then informed the women that she did not even think that Ioan Connor had this feeling, because all the time that she knew him, he was only doing some things. Rosen concluded that it was, so she told Layla that she was right. The girl added that despite this, John is still the best hero in modern times. Rosen caught herself thinking that she also thought about Ioan all the things that Layla had now confirmed, and noted that no one would ask her opinion about such a famous hero. Rosen then crouched down across from the little girl and said she had enough questions answered, so it was time to move on to fulfilling her part of the deal. Rosen asked the little girl for some small thing to show magic with her, and Layla replied that she had a coin and, reaching out her hand, dropped it into Rosen's palm. The girl watched Rosen's actions and asked with interest what she would do with her now. But Rosen mysteriously answered that magic surrounds them everywhere. You just have to look closely. Leia kept her eyes on the coin Rosen was holding. But after a quick movement that the witch made in front of the little girl's eyes, the coin mysteriously disappeared from her palm. Rosen triumphantly showed her empty hand, and the girl's eyes widened in surprise. Rosen concluded that only intermediaries are needed to perform magic. Layla excitedly began to shout that the coin had disappeared from Rosen's hand, and Rosen held it near the little girl's ear, and the coin reappeared in her hand, which she showed to the surprised Layla. The little girl opened her mouth at what she saw. She couldn't believe that the coin had appeared out of nowhere. Rosen handed the coin to Layla and told her to keep her lucky coin. After that, Rosen whispered to Layla that at midnight her coin would turn into gold, but she shouldn't tell anyone about it, because the magic wouldn't happen. As Layla happily hopped back to her cabin, Maria asked Rosen if she had actually used magic, as she herself was quite surprised at what Rosen had just produced. Rosen tried to get comfortable on the floor to rest a little and answered Maria that there was no smell of magic. She showed the usual children's focus. Rosen added that the girl would find out sooner or later anyway. Maria then asked if Rosen herself had said that lying was not in her principles, but Rosen just waved it off, saying that nothing of the sort happened. When the conversation again turned to escape, Rosen said in disappointment that they were surrounded by only water and that it was simply impossible to cross it in a boat. Then Maria concluded that it is really impossible to get to the mainland by boat, but there is another place where they can go. Then Rosen looked at Maria with interest. Maria realized that Rosen was waiting for an explanation from her and said that she heard there was such a place in the world where all the witches were hiding, but she doesn't know if it really exists or if it's just some fiction. This island, known to everyone as the home of witches, is called Walpurgis. Maria then asked Rosen if she knew about this island before. Rosen said that she had heard from people that this island was not far from Monty Island, where they were currently headed, and that only the chosen witches could get there. After some thought, Rosen replied that this place was the last refuge of all witches, and she doubted very much that even if she managed to get there, she would be welcomed with open arms. Maria replied that Rosen should not be steamed, because it was just a joke, and asked if she thought it was really better to deceive the children when you are turning miserable. Rosen didn't understand what this question was about, so she just stared at the ceiling and thought about herself. But Maria unexpectedly asked whether to try such a method on Commander Ioani. Then Rosen thought it was a really good idea, and she agreed with Maria that in their case, it was the only way she hadn't used yet. After all, using the main character of the military events that ended recently and receiving a lucky ticket of sympathy from him sounded quite real. Such methods, which she used on the supervisors, idiots, are unlikely to work on Ioan, and it seemed like a good idea to Rosen, so she decided to think it over better. Ioan Konar was a military pilot and moreover, a hero, which was the complete opposite of the young girl herself and her current authority. His life was a complete victory. She was sure that she would succeed because Na would easily be able to become someone pitiful and downtrodden, to cry somewhere, and to hand the victory over herself to her opponent. She knew 100% that the feeling of superiority over someone is much more pleasant and causes much greater dependence than the feeling of love. And it is this feeling that is much easier to achieve from a person like John than the feeling of love. Everything that the young girl managed to learn about her supervisor pointed to exactly this. John looked at his assistant and said in his mind that of course Henry would get a little better with time and such feelings would constantly return to him and bring him back to the past. Then Ioan remembered how he had been told in the past that there might come a moment when feelings would just burst out, and the feelings you will feel are unknown to whom. Then Connor asked what he should do when this moment comes, and the woman explained that in this case it is not necessary to stop the feelings, but to let them fully come out. What will be in his soul? The man looked into the sea distance, and the words that he remembered for the rest of his life sounded in his head. Under no circumstances give specific answers until it is over. Connor could see how worried Henry was now, so he told him that they had been on deck long enough and should go back inside. Henry agreed that it would be better that way. On the way to the cabin, they continued to chat, and Henry said that no matter how much he thought, he could not accept that the war hero had been ordered to transport some witch from Alcafez. Connor replied that there is nothing you can do about it, because the task of a military man is to carry out orders. But Henry remarked that he hoped that after this at least Connor would be promoted to a high position. Henry added that in this world John was hated only by the scum of the ground forces and the people of Rio Righton, because of whom they were forced to endure these damned trials. They knew that it was Connor who was blamed for the disaster with Rio Righton, and in exchange for his restoration of reputation, he was tasked with transporting the only survivor from that city to the island of Monty. Connor remembered the conversation in his office when his superior had said that if he took that bastard survivor of Rioreton to the island and ostentatiously threw her out to play, he would be forgiven for losing the war. He was given this order to whiten his reputation, and after that, Iwan Konar was to become the ideal hero of the Empire and a role model for the following generations. Henry also knew about this plan, so he asked his commander, as soon as they cope with this difficult task, he must rest and live at least a little for himself. Henry looked at his boss and asked him if he correctly understood that in the future only a brilliant career awaits him. So all these trials are not in vain on their way. But Connor thought hard about this statement because he had some doubts about it. He realized that he had returned as a hero from the war when he passed through the triumphal arch in the military uniform of a pilot, which he proudly wore from the very beginning of his military career. The huge crowd that gathered to greet him chanted only his name, and hundreds of flowers flew to his feet. People joyfully greeted their hero and gathered to see him live. However, watching all this, he asked himself if he really felt joy, and if his emotions overflowed with some kind of satisfaction as he looked at this chanting crowd. Now he does not even remember whether he smiled when he passed through the triumphal arch and whether his smile was convincing, if he really passed with her. He understood that it was simply impossible to protect everyone, so it was unclear to John the price of victory when so many innocent lives were lost during the war. Henry supported his commander and said that he was not God and could not save everyone. But Ioannis replied that all the blame lies with the commander, because it is he who makes the final decision. But returning to their immediate problems, Henry said that Ioann should not pay attention to Rosen Oker, because she is really quite a dangerous criminal, and if he wants to, he will interrogate her himself. Ioann sharply replied that he would deal with this Rosen himself, and Henry should not pay attention to these problems, but rather focus on restoring his emotional state. As soon as Ivan Konar closed his eyes, he immediately remembered the words that he was not to blame for the deaths of those people from Rioreton. He was told that if it weren't for him, everything would have collapsed. He witnessed that at that time, all approved aviation strategies were just a complete card game, and no one could know the final result of their actions. But one question bothered Connor himself. If he is not to blame for the death of his relatives and all the residents of that city, then who is responsible for it? He remembered the conversation with his boss when he was given the mission order, and the man mentioned that he was to escort the prisoners to Monty Island and especially look after Rosen Walker. Before the task itself, the young man reread hundreds of newspapers, which talked about this famous fugitive and tried to study her biography in detail. The amazing fact remained that Rosen Walker was the only person who managed to survive from Rioreton, and so it depressed Ioanna even more. When he looked at the headlines of the local newspapers, the only thing that came to his mind was why the only survivor from that city was the witch from Al-Kafez. These thoughts did not give Connor rest either day or night, and he was constantly in his thoughts. But suddenly, a woman's voice brought him back to reality, and he raised his head. Connor saw Rosen Walker sitting across from him, who folded her hands on her chest in displeasure and asked why she had been summoned if he wasn't listening to what she was telling him. Connor looked at the girl sitting across from him and finally realized that he was in a cabin on a ship headed for Monty Island, and his task was to deliver a dangerous criminal to prison. He quickly gathered his thoughts together and said that they should continue and now move on to the shark's diet. He began to tell what these predators liked to eat. T. Rosen was not going to put up with these constant reminders about how dangerous it was to cross the sea, so she stood up abruptly and threw all those papers off the table. She yelled at him that she had learned well enough that escaping the ship was simply not realistic, so there was no need to bring it up every time they met, unless he thought she was completely stupid. Satisfied, Connor smiled, because that was exactly what he was trying to achieve with his actions. Therefore, he held up another piece of paper and said that if she really knew how to think with her head, she would not dare to take this step. The girl looked into his eyes and asked if he really thought she couldn't use her head, and Connor replied that he thinks she is brave and that many consider her a dark hero. Roseanne was pleasantly surprised by such a compliment from Connor, so she asked him directly if he thought she was a brave hero or a dumb fool. Ioann looked at the girl and said that according to his criteria, he considered her a fool if she escaped from the prison and warned her not to be so aggressive. Rosen asked if he had called her a fool, and Connor notes that he answered her question. Then the girl replied that it would be much more stupid to sit behind bars for 50 years and wait for her death. She looked into his eyes and waited for his answer because she understood from private conversations that he is only interested in those cases when she makes all kinds of nonsense. As she had guessed, he immediately lowered his eyes and began to write something down. Konar then added that if she had pleaded guilty at the first sentencing, she would have received a reduced sentence. Ioann continued that for good behavior, the girl would receive an early release or a transfer. But she unexpectedly denied that in such a case, she would not have got out of Rioreton alive. After these words, He looked at her in such a way that he was ready to kill her right away. Then she immediately noted in her mind that such jokes would not be allowed here. She asked that she did not understand why she should rot in prison for 50 years. Iowan replied that the law states that for murder, one should serve from 8 to 50 years. Already in a more serious tone, she asked why she was sentenced to 50 years, when her neighbor who beat his wife to death received only 8, and why was such an injustice to her. Connor also raised his voice and said that the reason for this is also written in the legislation, and it was according to it that a fair sentence was passed in her case. The girl looked at her opponent and admitted that she did not know how to read a book and could not verify his words. He said that he knows about it and that everything is written in the legislation. After the young man carefully jotted down something in his notebook, he abruptly got up from the table. Rosen understood that the audience would be over, and today it was much faster. When Iowan stood over Rosen, he pointed out that the fact that she was sentenced to life imprisonment on the island of Monty was only her fault, and no one else should be blamed for it. He also noted that he had been condescending to her for quite a long time, and that was the end of his patience. The girl did not expect this from this gentleman, so she asked for one more second of attention. But he sharply replied that their meeting was over and grabbed her by the shackles, telling her to leave his office. She understood that if she left now with nothing, everything would happen again. There were a few steps left to the door, and she decided to use the last chance and say something stupid enough to hook him and continue the conversation. She ordered herself to quickly come up with something to get his attention, because there might not be another chance to chat. So she shouted at his back that he was just like her. He stopped and looked at her with a surprised look, demanding that she explain what she meant when she said that he was the same as her. She said that he is as much a fool as she is, because only one paper document distinguishes a hero from a fool, and these are his own words. Rosen boldly looked into his eyes and said that they are exactly the same. Only he is a light hero, and she is a dark hero, but in fact they are both stupid. The young man couldn't even move because of the surprise. He kept his eyes on her and tried to understand where such thoughts appeared in her head. She boldly continued that they were no different from each other, because no one before that thought that their country would somehow be able to win the war. They lived in a small country, which differed from others only by the designation empire, while their opponent Talus had already managed to conquer several states by that time. John disagreed with her and said that they had won this war anyway, but Rosen countered that they didn't get anything after the win, so the win was completely pointless. Rosen added that after the war, there were only cities left in ruins and thousands of lost people, and heroes like him were dressed in a new uniform, and now he escorts worthless prisoners. Rosen jabbed at him and asked why such illustrious heroes were doing such a job. Iowan, who was always calm, got impatient. He grabbed her by the shackles and shouted for her to shut her mouth. She had never seen Iowan so nervous, so she mentally noted that he picked up on her provocation. And she asked in a more cheerful voice whether he considered his current position a victory. Connor yelled at her not to talk nonsense. Meanwhile, the young girl added that such a victory is simply grandiose, and he now has something to be proud of after participating in military operations. The girl looked into his eyes and asked if he wanted to hit her now, and for her to endure physical pain is not a problem, so he can show his heroism and crush her to the floor with his shoe. His eyes filled with rage, and he barely restrained himself from hitting the young girl. She provoked him more and more, saying that everything was fine because she was used to pain. It was the last straw, and he hit the wall painfully with his fist. Then he looked at her with an angry look and said that she was right in what she said and had no right to say it. Connor said that many of the pilots he knew had died in the skies of his homeland, protecting the country during the war years. History does not remember them, and will never even remember some of them. Despite this, they still gave their lives for the sake of other people. And he doubted that a person who constantly ran away from justice would be able to appreciate it in a dignified way. Iowan told Rosen that he did not expect, of course, that people like her would show gratitude to these heroes, and he would not allow anyone to disrespect their comrades in arms. And then the young man closely approached her and said that he understood that she was trying to provoke him and draw attention to herself. But not thanks to her lies or provocation, she will not succeed in deceiving him. Connor also added that if she wants to get any sympathy, then she better find someone else for the role. She looked into his eyes and doubted that she had just managed to provoke him. Rosen once again told him that she was not lying, but he, just smiling, said that he was not at all surprised by her words and her efforts to attract his attention. Connor said there was no need to shackle prisoners in this sea, as they had no chance of escape, and she was put on the hook due to the gravity of her crime to reiterate that point. These words sounded so cruel that she couldn't believe how one and the same man could say such a thing. She remembered his soft and confident voice during the war. That's why she, looking into his eyes, said that Ioan Konar is actually a bigoted jerk. He replied that he had sufficiently understood what Rosenhaus imagined himself to be, and when the young girl turned around, approaching the exit, he said that they would no longer have personal meetings and ordered her to return to her cell where she belongs. When the door to John Connor's office slammed shut, she thought for a moment and decided that she shouldn't expect anything else from a conversation with this young man. Clutching her shackles tighter, she remembered the words she heard every day during the air alert, when a calm male voice announced that there was no need to worry. This voice constantly reminded the locals that when they heard the signal, they should go down into the dungeons and wait for further instructions on the radio, while he would protect them from the sky in the meantime. When she heard this man's voice during military operations, she always dreamed of meeting this man in person, and now she understood that it would be better if her dreams did not come true, especially under such circumstances. The young girl, without realizing it, constantly fell into some kind of self-deception, forgetting about the reality in which she was at the moment. Now she understood that if she continued to communicate with him in the future, then his warm and calm voice, which she had admired so much in the past, could lead to her collapse. But then Rosen made a decision that no hero who now wants to convince her that she should not run away will be able to change her principles, so she should fulfill it by heart. Her thoughts were interrupted by Heron, who mockingly asked her why she dressed up like that and suggested that if she had something red at hand, she would have also painted her lips. Then Rosen demonstratively straightened her hair and seductively asked if he liked looking at her like that. The man only cursed, saying that it was no longer funny. They went to her cell and Heron asked what trick she used this time. Rosen just smiled and said that she managed to save a little drinking water, which was already in short supply. Heron said seriously that no matter what tricks she used, they definitely wouldn't work on him. Rosen, smiling, asked if he knew anything about her tricks. And then the young girl said that the main trick is when a young man and a woman are left alone. Then only the Almighty knows what is happening there. Heron frowned and told her to close the box and stop telling her perverted fantasies. And she looked at him seductively and asked if he liked her. The enraged Heron only had time to shout that she was a fool, and Rosen, smiling, said that he asked her about tricks so often that she had come to this conclusion. Then the young man turned away from Rosen and said that he would not talk to her in this case if she was up to something stupid. But Rosen kept talking to Heron. When they passed by the corridor, the young man kept chasing her because he already wanted to get rid of her company and put her behind bars. But Rosen noticed something at the end of the corridor. The young girl looked closely and saw a little girl there whom she had already met near her cell. And it was really Lila who was looking for something in her mixture. At that moment, the young girl thought that this girl was once again roaming fearlessly where she wanted, and wondered if it was possible to treat her like this. Rosen caught herself thinking that now that she sees Layla and Heron next to each other, they really look alike. So it's not surprising that they are actually relatives, and she could have noticed it earlier. When Heron almost reached her cell, the young girl decided to take advantage of this moment and turned to the young man. Heron turned his head in the direction of the young girl, and Rosen, coming close to him, asked that his niece was quite a cute girl. Rosen wanted to catch Heron off guard with her question. She succeeded 100%, and the young man turned pale. He glared at her and asked what she had just said about his niece. Rosen saw that he was hooked on her, so she decided to take out another trump card from her sleeve and said that this girl's name was Layla, and it was quite easy to find information about the girl. Rosen looked mysteriously to the side, signaling the young man to look there as well. Heron quickly turned his head to that side and involuntarily dropped the keys from his hands. The young man saw that his niece was standing at the end of the corridor looking for something in her purse. Meanwhile, Rosen asked with a smile if he was scared for the girl. The girl calmly considered something for herself and then took out a candy and decided to taste it while, as she thought, she was left alone on this ship. When Heron made sure that everything was fine with the little one, he breathed a sigh of relief. Rosen, meanwhile, asked what she could do when she was in chains with his niece. While the young man was coming to his senses, Rosen imperceptibly crouched down and took the keys that fell out of his hands. Meanwhile, he said that he always thought she was a witch. But then he suddenly broke down and began to shout at Rosen that she should be brought to light quickly and that everyone would learn about her crimes. And he threatened her not to touch his niece with a finger. Meanwhile, the little girl, not seeing what was happening behind her, heard these screams and involuntarily looked at the candy. She began to cough, trying to spit out what was preventing her from breathing. Rosen immediately noticed that the little girl was sick and screamed for a doctor to be called for help, because she noticed that the girl was already turning blue and losing consciousness. Heron was shocked and could not move. Rosen screamed for this jerk to come to his senses, because his niece was dying and needed medical attention as soon as possible. Rosen called for help, but no one heard her. In her mind, she cursed this jerk, who stood still and did not move, and decided that in such a case, All the responsibility rested on her. No matter how much Rosen shouted, no one responded, and she realized that now they were in that part of the ship where usually there was almost no one, and she began to think what she should do. Rosen tried to shout to Heron because she wanted him to come to his senses and at least release her from the shackles so that she could try to help Lila herself. At that moment, Rosen remembered the distant past, how Emily had told her about first aid and cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Rosen kept asking herself then whether she had to learn it. Rosen looked at the young man and decided that today her knowledge, acquired in the distant past, could be useful to her in such a responsible situation. Emily explained to the young girl that a person can get into a critical situation not only during the war, so everyone should know how to provide first aid. A long time ago, Rosen asked Emily why she was telling others this and teaching them how to provide medical care. Then, Emily explained that one person would simply not be physically able to save everyone. Having freed herself from the shackles with the help of a key, Rosen, who had the strength, ran to help the little girl. Although deep down she doubted that she would succeed, and it was absolutely necessary to try. The young girl caught herself thinking that at that moment she did not even think about whether she would be able to save Lila. She just mechanically ran to do what every person should do. Not everyone has the opportunity to possess magical abilities, but anyone can need them at any moment in their life. That is why little Lila was counting on a miracle at that moment. People traveling on the same ship immediately reacted to the commotion and came out of their cabins, lighting candles and asking each other what happened. Someone said that the girl became ill and was saved from death. People expressed their admiration for the brave man who saved the life of the granddaughter of the captain of the ship. Not believing what had happened, Rosen hugged the little girl and tried to calm her down, although she herself would not mind someone's support after the rescue of little Layla. Rosen's heart was beating at an incredible speed, and she could not realize that she had managed to save the girl perfectly. Layla hugged her savior and cried, not believing that now she could breathe freely and nothing threatened her life. So they sat and comforted each other, and Rosen only then realized that she had saved this child's life a few minutes ago. Heron, when he recovered from the shock, immediately ran to his niece with tears in his eyes and hugged her. He asked if she was all right, because he couldn't believe that her life was now safe. The people traveling on this ship discussed the events of the night, and each of them added new details to this adventure. After all, saving a person happens quite infrequently. People whispered among themselves that only one young girl who was imprisoned did not get lost, and immediately rushed to the little girl and gave her first aid, saving her life. Rosen watched as Layla was hugged by her own uncle and calmed the frightened girl. She said she thought Layla had some foreign object stuck in her throat. Everyone said that a terrible tragedy almost happened, and they were very grateful to the young girl who saved Layla and provided medical care so skillfully that even the doctors could envy. When Rosen moved away from the shock, she looked at the scene of the adventure and saw a pink ball rolling on the floor. She paid attention to it and looked closely, trying to understand what it was. Rosen's hand reached for the ball, and now she saw that it was candy. She remembered how she saw the girl standing with her back to them and looking for something in her bag. At that moment, Rosen thought that the absurdity of the situation is that both a bullet and an ordinary candy can kill a person at any moment of his life. And then the young girl realized that not only military personnel can save lives, but also ordinary people. The main thing is some first-hand knowledge and desire to help another person. Sitting with her back to Layla and Henry, the young girl was glad that the jerk was finally able to get a hold of himself and asked him if he liked her ability mastery. And then Rosen added that if he really liked her, then as a thank you, he could give her water so she could wash or leave more food in her cell so she wouldn't starve. Rosen felt someone's presence, but she could not understand why that Heron did not answer her. After all, she asked for so little, in exchange for the saved life of his own niece. But when the young girl turned and raised her eyes, she saw that John Connor was standing solemnly opposite her, holding in his hands the shackles that she had thrown off a few minutes ago. Of course, Rosen expected to see anyone in front of her, but not this strict supervisor, whom she had said goodbye to in his office before this unexpected situation. The young girl, looking into his eyes, was only able to speak, asking why he was here. He continued to silently drill her with his stern gaze, which sent shivers down her spine. This silent scene was disturbed by some conversations on the side, and the young people turned their heads there. They saw Layla, who was hugging a respectable man and joyfully calling him grandfather. Rosen kept her eyes on this man and realized that he was the famous captain of the ship, because Layla had told her about it herself. The little girl hugged her grandfather and was sincerely glad that she had survived. Then the young girl, admiring such a picture, breathed a sigh of relief and decided that all her efforts were not in vain. because it was worth it for the grandfather to hug his granddaughter once more. The young girl began to make excuses, saying that she just said about the water and helped the girl just like that, not having in mind any intentions to receive a reward for the rescue. John lowered his gaze and said that such a reward was a trifle compared to her deed. Rosen, holding her breath, waited for what he would say next. Ioan didn't make himself wait long and told Rosen that the Imperial Army always values the lives saved and thanks those who contributed to their preservation. The young man then handed the shackles to Rosen and added that she would receive her rewards despite the fact that she was a dangerous criminal headed for Monty Island. The shackles clattered ominously in his hands, reminding Rosen of who she was and that she was to be chained in this iron again. He, holding them, waited for her to submissively extend her hands to him. Rosen thanked him for agreeing to such small requests of hers and allowing her to wash, so she questioned if this was really a joke and if she should expect such a reward. He cold-bloodedly put the shackles on her, and she was trying to figure out how to wash her with those damn irons on her hands, because she's not some vegetable that just needs to be doused with water from above. Ioan remarked that people could be placed near her to help her wash, and she would be able to feel like an important person, although of course this was not supposed to be the case in her life, especially here. The young man mercilessly put the shackles on her, and Rosen felt pain, after which she cried out loudly and asked to be more careful with her. But Connor paid no attention to her request. But suddenly a loud, angry male voice was heard, addressing John Connor, calling him a tactless brat. And when Rosen turned around, she saw the angry captain of the ship. He yelled at Ioan, asking him if this was how he had taught him to treat the saviors and what he was allowing himself by putting her in chains after such a bold act. John found nothing better to do than guiltily ask the ship's captain what he meant. At that moment, Rosen thought that this brat needed his arrogant behavior. John noticed that there were other passengers on the ship, but the captain denied that he had asked Henry to escort everyone to their cabins without exception so that there would be no commotion. Then the captain turned to Connor and asked him to release this lady at least for a few hours, because they had nothing to worry about, because the whole sea around them was full of sharks. And when John Connor tried to deny this man that such a thing could not be done, the captain shouted that everything is possible in this world, if you really want it. John tried to tell that according to the laws of the Empire, the criminal should be in chains, and the captain, loudly banging his stick on the floor, shouted that the laws of land do not apply at sea. And then the captain of the ship looked into the eyes of John Connor, hit his chest with his fist, and shouted that he was the law on this Vihas liner and would do as he saw fit. Rosen was surprised to watch the altercation of two men who did not want to give in to each other. At that time, the captain asked Connor if he had even a shred of sympathy for the savior of little Lila. And then the captain, in a calmer voice, said that the shackles should be removed from the young lady, at least for the time being, while he was thanking her, because it would not fit into any gate at all. While Ioan tried to deny the captain and prove that Rosen remains a criminal, Layla smiled at her savior and Rosen waved her hand in return. The captain gently patted the little girl on the head and, turning to Ioan, reminded that Rosen was first of all a savior for him, so they should treat her properly. Ioan nevertheless replied that Rosen remains a criminal, and the captain angrily snapped at Connor, saying that he constantly needed to insert his 5 cents into the conversation. And while Connor, stretching himself, explained that he was a military man who had received an order to deliver the intruder to prison accordingly, the captain turned to Rosen with a smile. In a calm tone, the man asked for forgiveness from the young girl for the ill manners of this young man, and asked to accept words of thanks from him personally. The captain bowed before Rosen, and the girl was embarrassed, not expecting such respect from him. He was already continuing to speak, introducing himself to the young girl. The man said his name was Alex Revel, and he was a retired admiral in the Navy. He hoped that his name was known to the young girl. Rosen immediately understood that she had heard this name somewhere, and remembered the statue in the middle of the main square of the capital, where this man was forever engraved in a bronze statue as a war hero. Joyful lights lit up in her eyes, and she exclaimed that of course she knew about his exploits during the First War, and admired his courage and bravery. Even children like Rosen, who did not have the opportunity to go to school and receive an education, knew for sure about the exploits of this outstanding man and soldier. Rosen did not expect that such a well-known person would be the captain of the ship, so she was a little flustered when it was her turn to introduce herself. She said her name was Roseanne Walker. He replied that of course he knew about her and asked permission to call her Lady Walker, then remarked that his only granddaughter might be dead today if it weren't for that young lady's courage. Then the captain, looking at the young girl, asked that as far as he had heard, she wanted to wash and dine, as a token of thanks for her brave deed. Rosen replied that she would be very grateful if water would be brought to her cell so that she could wash herself, and a dinner that would contain at least a piece of meat. But the captain replied that it was completely impossible, and Rosen looked at him questioningly. Alex added that it is not appropriate to treat the saviors of the Revel family like that, and he has another proposal. Rosen looked at this handsome man with a confused look and did not understand what he wanted to ask her, so she silently waited for what Alex Revel would say. The captain of the ship told the young lady that if she had no personal plans for tomorrow evening, he would invite her to have dinner with his family.